Looking back now, it's hard to believe how much my life has changed. Growing up in a small town in Georgia, everything felt simpler and more predictable. My family wasn't perfect, but I always thought we had each other's backs. My younger brother, Billy, was always causing trouble, but I believed we were close. I never imagined that everything I thought I knew would fall apart because of him. I worked as a mechanic, helping my dad run our family garages, and I was married to my high school sweetheart, Teresa. Life seemed good, until it all unraveled. Teresa and I had been married for a few years when things started to fall apart. Billy, always the troublemaker, got deeper into pills, and my family began enabling him in ways that hurt me deeply. Despite my objections, they pressured me into letting Billy stay with us while he got his life together. What happened next shattered everything I valued. The betrayal that came from my brother and my wife destroyed my trust, my family, and my sense of home. The day started like any other. The backyard was filled with laughter, and the smell of barbecue hung in the air. Friends and coworkers had gathered to celebrate my promotion to shop foreman. But to me, it felt more like a goodbye party. I was ready to walk away from everything. I stepped away from the crowd, my mind racing, knowing what was about to happen. This wasn't just a promotion party, it was my farewell. I turned and looked back at the family cookout behind me. The gathering was in my honor, celebrating my recent promotion to shop foreman. It was an adult party with about half a dozen coworkers and their spouses, no kids around. I was thankful for that because I intended to make this my farewell party. When I had the chance, I went to my truck. I grabbed what I thought I'd need for a visual aid. I figured they'd ask me to give some kind of speech, and I wanted to make it memorable. I discreetly placed the item in my waistband, making sure it was out of sight. As I walked back through the guests, I saw my boss coming toward me. Tommy Peterson was a big guy with a smile that could light up half of Dallas. Even in his 50s, he had a presence that demanded respect, but also put you at ease. Beside him was Martha, his wife, my problem. Okay, maybe she wasn't the real problem. Maybe she was just the idiot who kept opening the door and letting the real problem in. Either way, it was getting handled today. Martha Peterson was more than a little heavy, but she still looked decent, even in her 50s. She had that kind of personality that drew people to her, like a mother or grandmother to everyone. The problem was she believed that old saying, "Mama knows best." Ever since I moved here 11 months ago, she'd made it her mission to set me up with the perfect woman. It didn't matter what I did or said. She couldn't get it through her thick skull that I wasn't interested in dating. I was still getting over my first marriage. Maybe if I had yelled or caused a scene, she would have gotten the message, but that's just not me. I tend to be quiet, polite, and private. Maybe I should have been more of a fool. Well, that's about to change. There they sat, Martha and some of the other wives, all beaming like they'd just caught a mouse. They thought they'd found the perfect girl for me. And there she was, sitting with them. She was beautiful, barely 5 feet tall, with a good figure, long blonde hair, and a pretty face. She always looked great since she worked at a beauty salon. I had to hand it to them. I thought she was perfect for me, too, until about 2 years ago. Unfortunately, the perfect woman they'd been pushing on me the last couple of months was my ex-wife, Teresa. What really made my blood boil was that they knew this. I hadn't told them the full story behind our divorce because it wasn't any of their business. I just told them I didn't want to date her, talk to her, or even be in the same state as her. And now there she was, surrounded by a group of women who were very pleased with themselves for getting us face to face. Teresa probably hadn't told them much about why our marriage ended because she was good at leaving out the important details. When she didn't want to face something, she had a way of charming almost everyone she met. She told them she'd made a mistake and that I refused to talk to her or forgive her. She played the role of the broken and remorseful wife perfectly. Her, "I pray for a chance to show Doug how much I still love him" act had Martha and her group eating out of her hand. Tommy stood up, addressed the group, and finally introduced me. Showtime. I want to thank y'all for coming tonight. I know this was supposed to be a celebration, and I guess it is in a way. Tommy offered me the position of shop foreman, and I appreciate that. But sir, I'm going to have to decline because as of today, I quit. Sorry for springing this on you, and I'll understand if you don't want to give me a good reference, but I'm leaving tomorrow, no matter what. I watched their shocked faces as Tommy opened his mouth to speak. "This is my home," he said sternly. "No disrespect to you, sir. You've been more than fair with me, and I owe you an explanation. But there are others here," I said coldly, "that I sure as hell don't owe anything to." Martha tried to cut in. "Doug?" Martha, I think you and your little group have done enough to me. I made it crystal clear I didn't want to date anyone, and I damn sure made it clear I didn't want to be around my ex-wife. Apparently what I want doesn't matter, so either I speak now or I leave for good. Your choice. Either one sounds fine to me. The group was silent except for the sound of Teresa crying. All right then, let me tell you a story. Teresa looked up at me, shaking her head slowly, her eyes pleading for me to stop. About 2 years ago, I left my small hometown in Georgia. For the first time in my life, I walked away from a broken marriage and a family that turned their backs on me. I came here 11 months ago to start fresh, but it seems I can't escape my past. It keeps catching up to me, with some help. I glared at Martha until she looked away. I married my high school sweetheart 5 years ago. She was everything I had ever wanted. We got married after she graduated, and for 3 years, I thought we had the perfect marriage. She worked at a beauty salon, and I worked at one of my family's garages. My dad owned several shops across northern Georgia, and that's where I learned to be a mechanic. But just like Eden had a serpent, so did my marriage. And my serpent was my younger brother, Billy. Billy is 3 years younger than me, but he's always been the focus of my family's attention. Supposedly, he's a recovering pill-hooked and has been since he dropped out of school at 15. My parents have always bent over backward for him, sacrificing themselves, and me, for whatever was best for Billy. We have to help him. He's sick, they'd say more times than I can count. So, 3 years ago, when I heard he'd been kicked out of his latest place, I wasn't surprised. My family, including my wife, wanted him to stay with us until he could get into another rehab. My response wasn't just no, it was hell no. Both my wife and parents were shocked. How could I be so heartless and turn my back on my brother? In my mind, I wasn't turning my back on him, I was just done enabling him. For the next few weeks, they made my life miserable, pressuring me until I finally caved and let Billy stay. And how was I repaid for trying to be a good brother? I glared at my ex-wife, trying to stay calm. I don't know what story my worthless brother told her to get her into bed, but whatever it was, it worked. Of course, neither of them bothered to tell me. 2 months later, I got the big news. Honey, I'm pregnant. Like an idiot, I was thrilled. We had been trying for a baby for the past year. Imagine my surprise a few months later when the doctor told us there was a problem with the baby. A small heart defect. Something common in babies of mothers who use cocaine. My wife, of course, denied using any pills. Then the doctor said something that turned my world upside down. He mentioned studies suggesting that pill dependence in fathers could cause birth defects too. I started to get angry. The doctor asked if I'd been using pills. When I said no, he chalked it up to birth defects being a mystery, leaving me wondering. My wife, the person I trusted more than anyone, told me I was the father. But things weren't adding up. After the baby was born and had successful surgery, I wasn't stupid. I had a DNA test done. The results came back and that was that. I was an uncle. I lost it. I threw my cheating wife's stuff out of the house, grabbed my Glock, and went looking for that piece of crap brother of mine. I searched everywhere but couldn't find him. My parents had hidden him away in some out-of-state rehab, so how did they know? Well, that's another gut punch. Seems Billy had waited a whole week before telling them what he'd done. Then the four of them sat around, hoping I'd never find out. I filed for divorce the next day. The minute my soon-to-be ex-wife was served, the endless excuses and apologies started pouring in from her and my parents. I wouldn't talk to the cheating promiscuous for weeks. I couldn't stand the sight of her or the sound of her voice. I was in shock. Everything I had dreamed of was gone. I had been betrayed and lied to by the people who said they loved me. After a week of relentless pressure from my parents, I agreed to talk to her. I listened to all her excuses. He was depressed, said he had nothing to live for. I felt sorry for him. I was just trying to comfort him, but things went too far. The dope he was smoking messed with my head. It was only that one night. It was just pity's ex, and it didn't mean anything. Apparently, their first time was so bad that he started talking about eliminating himself. The second time, she restored his will to live. My ex-wife, aiming for sainthood, one depressed guy at a time, makes you wonder if she's been visiting homeless shelters to spread her joy. I swallowed the bitter taste rising in my throat. Teresa sat there quietly crying. My parents and Teresa were all over me like flies on manure. And they didn't stop there. They brought in others to try to talk sense into me. My personal favorite was when the pastor from the church my family had attended for generations came to visit. My family had given a lot to that church, funding a bunch of their projects. He went on and on about the power of forgiveness. After a while, I got fed up and agreed to forgive her, but with two conditions. The first was that he'd preach a sermon on Sunday about coveting your brother's wife. The second was that I'd stand in front of the whole congregation the next Sunday and give my testimony before I publicly forgave them. I smiled, remembering the look on his face. Never heard from him again. But my parents didn't stop. They said exactly what I expected. You need to be the bigger man. Teresa made a mistake, but her heart is in the right place. Your wife and baby need you. A real man wouldn't walk away from them. We raised you better than this. It went on and on. My dad eventually said how disappointed he was in me for not forgiving Teresa and Billy. I shot back how disappointed I was in them as parents. After that, I let them have it, telling them exactly what I thought. It was ugly. When they asked if I had read Billy's apology letter and told me I shouldn't blame him because he was sick, I lost it. I told them I had used his letter as toilet paper. I also made it clear they were never to mention his name to me again. When they didn't take me seriously, I made sure they got the message. I looked at the group, making sure I had their full attention. Reaching behind me, I revealed what I had been hiding, and there were surprised reactions from those around me. I thanked God I was at Tommy and Martha's house. Normally, pulling a weapon in Texas would get you shot, but Martha had banned weapons in her home, so I knew I was the only one carrying. The usual arsenal my coworkers kept would be in their trucks or cars. In a low, threatening voice, I continued, I see you're reacting the same way my parents did. I remember what I told them that day. Mention that prick's name to me one more time, and I was determined to confront him, no matter the consequences. I swear to God, you'll be burying your favorite son by the end of the week. I paused, watching the color drain from several faces. I'd made my point. Apparently, my parents believed me, since they haven't spoken to me since that day. Too bad I can't say the same for my ex-wife. I figured it was best to leave before I hurt someone, so I moved across the state line to Alabama to wait out my divorce. I left Teresa and the baby everything except for a few dollars, just enough to start over. I suppose I should be thankful. It took her 6 months to find me. I'd heard she had a breakdown and ended up in the hospital. Apparently, she tried to eliminate herself. She failed. Just like her attempt to stay faithful to her husband. Close, but no cigar. I looked at Teresa as she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed. I'd like to say I felt sorry for her, but I didn't. She had made me what I am by ripping out my heart. All that's left is the pain of my past and a rage I have to fight to control. Every day over the last 2 years, I've struggled to move on. Her constant stalking hasn't helped. She always said we were soulmates, destined to be together forever. I used to think it was silly, like something she'd read in a book and liked the sound of. Now I have my doubts. I've never felt so alone, like a piece of me is missing. I catch myself looking to my side, wanting to ask her opinion. Sometimes I even reach for her hand, but it's never there. My heart is growing colder, and my anger builds each time it happens. She had always been there for me. I remembered my high school graduation. My dad didn't make it because Billy had gotten into trouble again. Dad went to the police station to bail him out and talk to a counselor. My mom was so worried she was a mess, so I told her to go and be with Dad. So my graduation party was with friends and some extended family, but none of my immediate family. I tried to hide my disappointment, but Teresa saw right through me. She made sure I felt loved that night, in more ways than one. It really had been my special night. I woke up in the middle of the night after the party, lying in bed with her undressed body curled up next to me. I noticed my parents standing in the doorway, watching us. Slowly, I got up, put on my boxers, and walked over to the door. My dad looked like he wanted to say something about Teresa being there, but he thought better of it. My mom had tears in her eyes. They both whispered their apologies for missing my party. I lied and said it wasn't a big deal. I told them I'd be moving out soon and staying with my cousin until Teresa and I could get married. Then I shut the door in their faces. My focus snapped back to the present when a couple of people started to stand. I cleared my throat and shook my head. They quickly sat back down. I placed the Glock beside me and you could hear the sighs of relief. I looked at them and continued my story. When she tracked me down, she moved into the same trailer park I was living in. Even after I got a restraining order and filed a dozen complaints, I knew I needed to move again. The divorce finally came through, so I packed up and headed here to Texas. I bet she didn't mention the restraining order when she gave you her sob story about our marriage, did she, Martha? Martha, now crying, shook her head. Didn't think so. She's always been good at leaving out the important details. When I got to Texas, I was lucky to meet Tommy. He gave me a chance to start over and didn't pry into my past too much. I made it clear I didn't want to talk about my past, and once he confirmed I wasn't running from the law, he was fine with that. Unfortunately, his wife didn't listen. I hadn't told anyone where I was moving, not even my few friends back in Georgia. So, imagine my surprise when 3 months ago my ex-wife moved to town. The icing on the cake was when my boss's wife decided to play matchmaker and try to get me back with my cheating ex-wife. Martha started to speak, but I cut her off. You had your chance and you didn't listen. Now it's my turn, I said, my voice filled with enough rage to silence her. I've made it clear dozens of times over the past year. I didn't want to date, didn't want to talk about my past, and I damn sure didn't want to get back with my ex-wife. But apparently what I want doesn't matter. Martha sobbed. Doug, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I cut her off again. Didn't know? I spat. Since when do you need to know before you respect someone's privacy? Who the hell do you think you are that someone has to explain everything to you before you'll give them the decency of staying out of their life? My words hit home. It was time to wrap up this miserable little performance. So, Martha, thank you and the rest of the busybodies for making my last 2 months a living hell. I'd wish you well, but that'd be a lie. Honestly, I hope you all turn on each other and make each other's lives just as miserable. I looked down at Teresa's tear-streaked face. Please, baby. Please, she begged. Give me another chance. I told you to get away from me, Teresa. Go home to your kid. I can't, she sobbed, unless I bring his daddy back with me. Come on, Teresa. You know I'm not his father, and I never will be. You gave up the chance for me to be a father when you slept with a man who used you and then ran off to get high again. Now you want to find the kid's dad? Try looking in a rehab or a gutter. I picked up my Glock, slid it back into my belt, and turned to leave. The crowd parted faster than a cheap dress at a NASCAR party. I heard a few people mumble apologies, and some even met my eyes. As I reached the driveway, Teresa's scream echoed behind me. No, Doug, wait! Please don't go! I can't live without you, Doug, she screamed, collapsing to the ground in tears. You have to come home. You just have to... I turned around and stared at her. Listen, you worthless pig. I don't care what you decide to do, just stay away from me. Just stay the hell away from me. You can screw around without me, so stop pretending you can't live without me. Next time I won't be so civil. And remember, I still have that restraining order, and I'm well within my rights to enforce it, if you catch my drift. I saw the crowd staring at me, still not really hearing what I had to say. I snarled and walked to my truck.
The doctors tell me that writing down my thoughts is good therapy, that it'll help me find myself. Honestly, I think they're full of it. They don't seem to get that I've lost Doug. He was my rock, my soulmate, my lover, my best friend, and until recently, my husband. I lost him because of one stupid mistake, a mistake he just can't forgive. To understand us, you need to know our story. Doug and I started dating in high school. He was a sophomore and I was a freshman. From the moment we first kissed, I knew I loved him. We went through high school together, and I always knew we'd get married. 3 months after I graduated, we tied the knot. I'm sure my parents were thrilled, not just because I was out of the house, but because we didn't have to get married, as good Southern Baptists. They were probably worried I'd get pregnant. My parents and I were always fighting. They loved Doug, but they didn't like how I lived. Too much sex and drinking for their tastes. Of course, they knew I only did those things with Doug. He was all I ever wanted. He was my soulmate, even when I was messed up. That never changed my love for him, though he doesn't see it that way. All he sees is the betrayal. He doesn't understand that when I see how much I've hurt him, it eliminates me too. Doug has always been my rock. Anytime I lost control, he was there for me. Until now. Most people see him as quiet and shy, but I know better. He's like a volcano. Calm on the surface, but things build up inside him until he explodes. I've seen it happen a few times, though rarely in public. Once it happened in front of our classmates. We were at a keg party drinking when this idiot, Jerry Whitmore, grabbed me. I slapped him, but the drunk idiot grabbed me again and tried to feel me up. I guess he had a last wish, doing that in front of Doug. Doug may not be the biggest guy, but he's strong and in great shape. Before Jerry could throw a punch, Doug had him on the ground, pounding his face. It took 3 guys to pull Doug off, and when they did, there was blood everywhere. Doug messed him up pretty badly, and there was talk of charging Doug. But I threatened to file sexual attack charges against Jerry, and everything was dropped. After that, I never had any issues with other guys. Like I said, Doug and I got married right after I graduated. It was the happiest time I can remember. He was already working as a mechanic in one of his dad's garages, and I went to beauty school. Soon, we saved enough to buy our first house. It wasn't much, just a little 2-bedroom place. But it was ours. Those first 2 years were tough because money was tight. But we had each other, and that was enough. I was so happy, like I was living in a fairy tale. Our marriage wasn't perfect, but it felt like it was. Sure, we had arguments, but I'd pout or cry, and Doug would give in. I didn't do that too often, though. I didn't want to take advantage of him. Our love felt like a shield, protecting us from the world. I guess that's why I didn't see the danger until it was too late. Everything changed when Billy got evicted from his trailer. He had nowhere to go, especially since he was fighting with Doug and his parents at the time. They didn't want him staying with them again after the last time, but they also didn't want him on the street. They asked if he could stay with us for a few weeks until they could get him into another rehab. I said okay, but Doug said no. I knew Doug had a lot of issues with his family, and most of them were justified. His parents, Tom and Paula, are decent folks, but they were unlucky enough to have a son who was a mess. That mess tore apart their family, and then destroyed mine too. Billy was always loud and wild, the kind of guy who'd do anything on a dare. Doug, on the other hand, was that quiet, steady force in the background. You always knew he was there. They were a team until Doug went to high school. Once Doug started hanging out with his football friends, Billy acted out even more, becoming an attention seeker. It wasn't a surprise when Billy started hanging out with the pill crowd. By that time, Doug and I were dating, and I saw how much it tore him up to watch Billy spiral. Billy became a full-blown hooked by his freshman year, and by the time Doug graduated, Billy had already caused serious damage to their family. He dropped out the same year Doug finished high school. Doug's parents tried everything but didn't know how to handle Billy. They tried sweet-talking, bribing, threatening, and eventually tried tough love. Billy used that as an excuse to drop out of school. After that, Tom and Paula pretty much gave in to him on everything. While I understood their struggle, their focus became all about Billy. They did everything for him and essentially left Doug to fend for himself most of the time. I know that really hurt Doug. Billy seemed determined to ruin his life. It was a shame because he had potential. Doug's a good-looking guy, but everyone used to say Billy would be even better looking when he got older. Unfortunately, with his dependents, we'll never know. Doug tried many times to reach out to Billy, but Billy's way of responding was to steal from Doug and their parents, using the money to buy more pills. By the time Billy turned 18, Doug had given up on him. We had been married for about 2.5 years when Billy got evicted. I'll admit Tom, Paula, and I were relentless in trying to get Doug to change his mind about letting Billy stay. I think Tom and Paula felt like they had no other options, and were weighed down by guilt. They didn't want Billy moving back in with them, since they'd just kicked him out months before after he stole money from them. I wanted Doug to reconsider, because you don't just turn your back on family, and besides, it was near Christmas. It would have been terrible to think of Billy living on the street during the holidays. Just a few days after Christmas, I let my fairy tale marriage come crashing down. Doug had called me, telling me he was working late to fix the transmission of a single mom's car. She was a mother of 3 and needed her car back, so he and one of his co-workers were staying through the night to get it done. God, I loved him for that. I got home late from the beauty salon, and as soon as I walked into the house, the smell of dope hit me like a wall. The smoke from Billy's grass was so thick it was like walking into a fog. I pounded on his bedroom door, but he didn't answer. Annoyed, I opened the windows to let the smoke out, then went to take a shower. Afterward, I got ready for bed, but the house still reeked of smoke. I had to close the windows because it was cold outside, so I banged on Billy's door again. This time, he opened it, and the way he looked scared me. His eyes were bloodshot, and I couldn't tell if it was from the smoke or if he'd been crying. He looked utterly hopeless, like he'd given up on life. He turned and sat down on the floor next to his bong. I walked in and immediately felt a rush from the lingering smoke. I'd smoked grass a few times before, so I knew what it was doing to me. I grabbed a fan, opened a window, and set it up to blow the smoke out. Billy just sat there, mumbling to himself. When I finished, I sat down beside him. Even though that night is fuzzy, I still remember how things unfolded. "Damn it, Billy," I said. "If Doug smells this when he gets home, he'll kick you out." "Maybe that would be for the best," he muttered. He looked so defeated. "It doesn't matter anyway," he sighed, staring at the ceiling. "I'm dying anyway." His words shocked me. It took a second to sink in. "Oh God, Billy, do you have AIDS?" I asked. He snorted and shook his head. "No, I hate needles, but I got proof I'm dying another way." He saw the confusion on my face. With a heavy sigh, he continued. "Even with the trash I hang around, I couldn't catch AIDS if I tried." I stared at him until I finally understood what he meant. I couldn't believe it. He had just turned 19. Did you go to a doctor?" "Yeah," he nodded. "The pills did it. I'm clean for STDs and AIDS, but that doesn't matter much now. I can't usually get it up, and when I do, it doesn't last. I barely have enough money to feed my habit, so getting some blue pills isn't gonna happen. If I can't be much of a man, what's the point? So being thrown out by my lucky big brother doesn't matter." We sat there in silence for a while. I'm ashamed to admit that I started thinking of ways to help him, most of which Doug would have hated. "Doug's not really lucky," I said. "He just works hard." "That's not what I meant," Billy mumbled, looking at me with teary eyes. "Then what?" I asked gently. "I was talking about you," he whispered. I blushed and turned my head so he wouldn't see. "Doug's always been lucky because of you. You give him the strength to do what he needs to do. Without you, he'd be just as messed up as I am. So yeah, he's lucky. If I'd found someone like you, my life would be different." He buried his face in his hands and sighed. I know now that he was just playing on my emotions, but back then, things were hazy. I think the smoke made everything foggy. If I could do it all over again, I would have gotten up and left right then. But I didn't. Instead, I opened the door to the end of my marriage. I glanced at him and saw a broken kid, someone with no reason to live. My heart sank as I felt his pain. I hugged him, and he rested his head on my shoulder while I gently stroked his hair. After a moment, he touched my cheek and kissed me softly. "Billy," I whispered, "you shouldn't." "Please, Teresa," he begged. "I've never kissed a good woman before. Please." I knew I should have stopped it, but I froze. I didn't kiss him back, but I didn't stop him either. He kissed me again and held me close. I didn't respond, but he must have taken my silence as permission. I tried to stop him. "Billy," I whispered again. "Please, Teresa. I need a reason to live." I knew it was a line, but I believed he was desperate. Whether it was the moment or something else, I didn't fight back. I just sat there, confused, unsure of what to do. It wasn't lovemaking, and there were no tender words. That was reserved for Doug, my husband. This was just sex. Nothing like what I had with Doug, who knew me, loved me. He had something no one else ever would. My heart. Afterward, I lay on him, both of us catching our breath. He whispered, "Thank you. Oh God, thank you." I lay there knowing I'd given him hope, and that felt good. I got up, and that's when reality hit. The weight of my betrayal crashed down. I dressed quickly and headed for the door. Billy called out, "Teresa!" I turned, tears filling my eyes. "Never again, Billy," I said quietly. "This can never happen again. Doug can never know, understand?" Billy nodded and lay back, covering his face. I think he started crying. I went to shower, trying to scrub away the guilt. I couldn't justify what I'd done, even though I hadn't planned to cheat. But Doug would see it as a betrayal, especially with his brother. I cried myself to sleep, knowing I had changed us forever. The next morning, Doug was furious. The smell of grass lingered. He nearly kicked Billy out, but didn't, for reasons I don't fully understand. I was a mess, trying to keep my emotions in check so Doug wouldn't suspect anything. That night, I made love to Doug like it was the last time, scared of what the future held. When he asked, I lied and told him I had a nightmare about him leaving me. He was so gentle, and for that night, we were whole again. I promised myself I'd never be so foolish again. In the following weeks, Billy watched me but didn't speak to me alone. He moved out 3 weeks later. 2 weeks after that, I found out I was pregnant. Doug and I were thrilled, and I had no doubt the baby was his. After all, we had an active sex life. It wasn't until Billy asked if he could be the father that I started to worry. I was furious and embarrassed to learn Billy had already told Tom and Paula. They weren't happy, but they didn't expose me. We all agreed to bury the secret and pray Doug never found out. I felt sick. I'd never kept anything from Doug before, but this would destroy him. Every night, I prayed the baby was his. But when the doctor said there was a problem with the baby, I knew my prayers hadn't been answered. Surgery could fix it, but the defect had been linked to Pillis. My heart stopped. The doctor asked if I used pills, and I denied it. Then he asked Doug the same, explaining that studies showed defects could be linked to the father's pill use. Doug nearly lost it until the doctor said nothing was certain when it came to birth defects. But I knew then the seed of doubt had been planted. Over the next few months, I tried to reassure Doug the baby was his without revealing my doubt. He never directly asked, but I was barely holding on to hope. After the baby was born, everything unraveled. Doug got a DNA test and found out Billy was the father. He threw me out that same day. My parents disowned me, and I ended up living with Doug's parents. Doug wouldn't speak to me for 2 weeks, and when he finally did, it was after his parents pressured him. Our conversation was one-sided. I begged Doug to listen, to see how sorry I was, and how much I needed him. I pleaded, cried, and did everything I could think of. But all he said was, "You slept with my brother and had his kid." For a week, his parents and I tried to get him to talk, and even Billy sent a letter apologizing. But I could see Doug's anger building, and his parents eventually stopped helping after Doug lashed out at them. I kept calling Doug, showing up at his work, desperate to talk. When he finally did, he unleashed every hateful word he could think of. He ripped off my wedding ring, and for the first time, I was truly scared of his rage. Then Doug moved to Alabama, and I spiraled. Imagining life without him was unbearable. I mixed sleeping pills with booze and ended up in the hospital on self-destruction watch. After that, Doug Jr., the baby, went to live with Tom and Paula. I don't see him much, and honestly, I don't care. He's just a reminder of what I lost. After I got out of the hospital, I tracked Doug down in Alabama. I moved to a trailer park nearby and got a job at a beauty parlor. I kept trying to talk to him, but eventually, he got a restraining order. Still, I didn't give up. Doug divorced me shortly after, likely because the judge knew the baby wasn't his. A few months later, Doug moved again, this time to Texas. It took me 8 months to find him. When I did, I took a different approach, slow and patient. I met some of the local women and subtly shared how much I wanted Doug back, without revealing everything. I got another salon job and waited. Eventually, Martha, one of the women I met, saw how much I loved Doug and how sorry I was. She helped set up a plan for us to talk at a party, but it went horribly wrong. Doug told everyone a harsh, condensed version of our story. When I begged him to come home, he told me to eliminate myself. I knew then it was truly over. After the party, I fell apart again. Martha got me to a hospital, and I ended up back on self-destruction watch. I haven't seen the baby since before my first breakdown. Tom and Paula are taking care of him and will probably adopt him. I can't stand to look at him. He's a constant reminder of my mistake and everything I've lost. I know it's not the baby's fault, but it doesn't change how I feel. Does that make me a terrible person? Absolutely. I've realized I'm a horrible wife and mother who lost everything that mattered. Maybe someday I'll figure out how to cope, but for now, I'm just stuck in this place, sickened by who I've become.
I sat there staring at the text on my phone. It had been 3 months since my party, and finally my future was becoming clearer. For the last 2 years since I left Teresa, I'd felt lost. I tried dating during that time, even slept with a few women, but it felt empty. What I really wanted, I couldn't have. I wanted my wife, the way she was before she slept with my brother. But I knew that was impossible. I still loved her, but I could never go back. She'd betrayed me, had a baby with my brother, and lied to me about it. Every hope and dream I had was wrapped up in her. She was my soulmate. Now, all I had left was pain and anger. I was lost, with no idea where I was headed. I buried myself in work just to avoid thinking. Then the text came, and everything changed. It said Teresa had liquidated herself. Before the text, I couldn't find a reason to live. Now I had a purpose. I wrote 2 short notes, enclosed them with a small black jeweler's box, and sent it by certified mail. Once I confirmed delivery, I packed up my truck and checked out of the motel. With a grin, I started the long drive back to Georgia. What was in the package I sent to my parents? One note to them said since the promiscuous took the easy way out, it was up to me, his uncle, to handle my nephew's future. I wrote that I knew they could support him financially once Billy and I were out of the picture. I ended by wishing them better luck raising my nephew than they had with Billy and me. The black box was addressed to my brother. Inside were 4 items: the smashed remains of my wedding rings, a single 9mm bullet, and a note with just 3 words: time to run. I knew Billy would be terrified and run to my parents, begging them to save him. Sure enough, he did. I got bombarded with phone calls and texts. Turns out, Billy had joined rehab after my divorce and had been living with my parents for the last 8 months. According to my parents' messages, Billy had been clean that entire time. They even got a restraining order against me. But I was set on revenge. Nothing could save Billy now. When I got to my destination, Billy was all I could think about. Teresa had cheated on me, and now she'd paid the ultimate price. No, I didn't consider her redeemed. She chose the coward's way out. Now it was Billy's turn to face the consequences. I stayed low at a motel 5 miles outside of town. At night, I went into town looking for Billy. I searched every familiar place, driven by the kind of focus you get when your world has been ripped apart. I didn't feel the cold, nor did I care about the aching in my legs. I was fueled by something darker. I started at the places I knew he'd frequent, the dive bar on Main Street where we used to shoot pool. The smell of stale beer brought back memories, but I wasn't there for that. I asked the bartender about Billy, but he claimed not to have seen him. It didn't matter. I kept moving. I hit every place that held a piece of our shared past. It was late when I found myself outside a club on the edge of town. It wasn't Billy's usual hangout, but something told me he'd be there. I walked in, scanning the dim room, the bass from the speakers vibrating in my chest. And then I saw him, Billy, sitting at a table with a couple of friends, laughing like he hadn't destroyed my life. I stayed in the shadows waiting for the right moment. Then I heard them talking. One of his friends, with a smug grin, said something that stopped my heart. "You really pulled it off, Billy. Seducing Doug's wife just to get back at him. I didn't think you had it in you. Guess that's what happens when you grow up in the shadow of the perfect sun, huh?" I couldn't breathe. The room spun as the truth hit me like a freight train. Billy hadn't just been reckless, he'd done it on purpose. Out of some twisted jealousy, he'd wanted to hurt me. I stormed out of the club before I did something I couldn't take back. Not yet, anyway. My heart was pounding and my fists were clenched so tight, my knuckles turned white. I needed to think. I needed a plan. This wasn't something I could rush, not if I wanted Billy to truly pay. I got into my car, parked a few blocks away, and sat there, staring into nothing, trying to calm the storm inside me. But one thing was clear. I wasn't letting him out of my sight. I wasn't going to let him slip away. For 3 days, I shadowed him. Every night I returned to that club, watching him from a distance. During the day, I followed him through town, keeping far enough back so he wouldn't notice. I learned his routine, where he went, who he talked to, and most importantly, when he was alone. I waited for that perfect moment, when I could strike without anyone getting in the way. On the 3rd night, he finally left the club alone, giving me the opening I'd been waiting for. I followed him as he made his way to his car, parked in a dimly lit back alley where the street lights barely reached. He fumbled with his keys, completely unaware of the footsteps closing in on him. I moved quickly, grabbing him from behind and covering his mouth before he could scream. He struggled, but he was no match for the anger that had been building in me for days. I dragged him to my car, threw him into the trunk, and slammed it shut, the sound echoing through the empty alley. I got behind the wheel and drove off. The rage I'd felt before was gone. Now I was cold, calculating. Billy had crossed a line, and it was my turn to show him what happens when you betray your own blood. Billy woke up in a pitch-black room. groggy and disoriented. His head throbbed as if he'd been knocking, but when he tried to move, he realized he was tied to a chair, his wrists and ankles tightly bound. Panic set in as he struggled against the ropes, but they wouldn't budge. His mouth was gagged, muffling his desperate attempts to scream. The air in the room was thick, heavy with the smell of damp concrete and something else, something cold and metallic. He tried to make sense of his surroundings, but the darkness swallowed everything. Then he heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing off the walls. The door creaked open, letting in a sliver of dim light. I stepped into view, my face hidden in shadow. I didn't say a word, just stared at Billy with a calm that sent chills down his spine. There was no anger, no hatred, just an unsettling stillness that made his blood run cold. I walked over, my movements controlled, deliberate. I pulled out a syringe filled with clear liquid, holding it up so Billy could see. His eyes widened in terror as he tried to shake his head, to plead with me, but the gag muffled any sound. Without hesitation, I administered the injection, knowing it was necessary for the situation. Billy felt the liquid enter his bloodstream, a cold sensation spreading through his body. His vision blurred, the room starting to spin. He tried to keep his eyes on me to focus, but the pill was taking over. His muscles weakened, his head slumped forward, and the panic faded into a dull, distant fear. I stepped back, still silent, watching as Billy's consciousness slipped away. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was my emotionless face, and he knew whatever came next would be far worse than anything he could imagine. When Billy woke up again, the sun was already high in the sky, beating down on the barren landscape around us. I stood a short distance away, watching as he struggled to sit up, his movements slow and disoriented. The vast Texas desert stretched out in every direction, offering nothing but sand, scrub, and an endless horizon. I walked toward him, the crunch of sand and gravel beneath my boots announcing my approach. He looked up at me, confusion and fear evident in his eyes. Sweat dripped from his forehead, and his lips were already cracking from the dryness. Beside him lay a single bottle filled with liquid and a syringe placed carefully next to it. He glanced at them, then back at me, his eyes wide and pleading for answers. "I thought about eliminating you quickly," I said, my voice steady but cold. "I thought maybe you deserved an easy way out after what you did, but then I realized that would be too merciful." He tried to speak, but his throat was too dry, and the words came out as a raspy whisper. I didn't care to hear whatever excuses or pleas he had. "You see, betrayal like yours cuts deep. My own brother slept with my wife, and now she's dead while you're still here." I paused, letting the weight of my words sink into the scorching air. "You took everything from me, Billy. So now I'm giving you a chance, either earn my forgiveness or meet your fate out here." I nudged the bottle with the tip of my boot, rolling it slightly closer to him. "That bottle has just enough to keep you going for a while. Stretch it out, and maybe it'll last a bit longer. And that syringe, it's got enough substances to numb the pain, or end it all if that's what you choose." He stared at the bottle and syringe, then back at me, tears welling up in his eyes. The reality of his situation was sinking in. "We're about 300 miles deep into this desert," I continued, gesturing to the endless expanse around us. "No roads, no towns, no people, just you and the elements. If, by some miracle, you make it out alive, maybe I'll consider forgiving you. Maybe we'll find a way past this. But if not, well, I guess that's justice." Billy started shaking his head, muffled sounds of protest escaping his dry throat. I could see the desperation and fear taking over, but I felt no sympathy. Not anymore. I turned and walked back toward my truck, parked a few yards away. As I opened the door, I looked back one last time. "Choices have consequences, Billy. This is yours." I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove off, watching as Billy's figure shrank smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror until it disappeared into the shimmering desert heat. As the miles between us grew, a swirl of emotions took hold. Anger, pain, a touch of satisfaction, and maybe even a hint of regret. Only time would tell if leaving him there was enough punishment, or if this decision would haunt me for the rest of my life. The desert has a way of stripping things down to their core, revealing the truth. Maybe out there alone under the unforgiving sun, Billy would finally realize the weight of what he'd done, or perhaps the desert would claim him, and with him, the last remaining ties to a family that had already been shattered beyond repair. Either way, I drove on, the open road ahead offering no answers, only the endless horizon and the hope that somewhere along the way, I might find peace. 5 days later, I was arrested for Billy's disappearance. I was tried, but there was no evidence linking me to the crime. I'd kept my phone switched off while I was in Texas, leaving no digital trail and no physical evidence of me being near him. The motel owner, a middle-aged single mother I had helped years ago on Christmas night, provided an alibi. I guess good deeds pay off in the end. My parents were furious, of course. My mother cursed me with every biblical punishment she could think of. My father just stared at me in silence, his disappointment clear. My lawyers argued that Billy had a history of running away and pill dependence. His body was found with a syringe in his arm and traces of vodka in an empty bottle. They claimed Billy had relapsed, run away again, and gotten lost in the desert. They suggested that Hooked sometimes hitchhiked between states, chasing a fix. I was acquitted of all charges. My parents haven't spoken to me since. It doesn't bother me anymore, not after everything. 6 months later, I found myself back in my hometown, trying to put the pieces of my life back together. I opened a garage, just like I'd always dreamed of. Working with my hands kept my mind off the past, off Billy, off the desert, and everything that came with it. Fixing engines and restoring old cars gave me a sense of control, something solid to hold on to. The town hadn't changed much, but I had. The familiar faces felt a little more distant now, but I stayed focused on my work, keeping to myself. It was easier that way. The garage did better than I expected. Word got around that I was back, and soon enough, people started bringing in their cars, trusting me to get them running again. It felt good to be useful, to have a purpose. Then there was Sarah. She brought in her beat-up sedan one day, a car that had seen better days. She was a single mom, just doing her best to get by. We started talking while I worked on her car, small talk about the town, her kid, life. But there was something about her, a quiet strength, that drew me in. We began seeing more of each other after that. I hadn't planned on it. I didn't think I was ready to let anyone in, not after everything that had happened. But Sarah had a way of making things seem simple, even when they weren't. She didn't pry into my past, didn't push me to open up. She just let me be. And somehow that was exactly what I needed. Her son, Timmy, was a great kid. Smart, curious, always asking about the cars I was working on. I found myself spending more time with them, helping out, fixing things around their house, just being present. It felt different, having people to care about again. But it felt right. Life wasn't perfect, and there were still nights when the past crept in, when the weight of what I'd done and what I'd lost pressed down on me. But with Sarah and Timmy, I felt like maybe I had a shot at something good again. Maybe this was the fresh start I'd been looking for, a way to rebuild, one day at a time. So I kept moving forward. The garage, Sarah, and Timmy, they were my future now. The past would always be there, lurking like a shadow, but I wasn't going to let it define me anymore. Not if I could help it.